to the Brittany Hughes Show, everybody, and what a week it has been. Of course, what has dominated the liberal news cycle is the January 6th hearings. I'm not going to lie, I haven't watched any of that bullcrap. I feel like it's an absolute waste of time. Not sure if you've been tuning in at all, but thankfully that is not what we're going to be talking about today because it is not worth it. I do want to show you this video though. We're not gonna get too far into this either, but I came across this one this week. This is one of the most bizarre things I have ever seen. And if I suffer, then you have to suffer. I wasted my brain space on this. So now you have to. We're gonna. Oh my gosh, y'all. Oh my gosh. This, you know how like every time we say that things have gotten so bizarre, you almost don't know like how it can be taken to the next level. Check this one out. So this is a girl. I'm so sorry. This is a person. I'm fairly certain that it's a female. You never know these days. This is a person that not only has a list of genders that he, she, it, they want to go by. Not only do their gender pronouns, their gender preferences change based on how they feel, they also change based on the gender of the person that is speaking to them. I am not even kidding you. Check this out.
Happy Pride, everybody. I already mentioned this in my story, but I've added a new set of pronouns to the pronouns that I'm comfortable being called. I've been sitting on Fair's pronouns for a while. And honestly, kind of psyching myself out about it. I'm like, oh, do I really want to like change this again? And then I like realized, I was like, who cares? Like, if I decide that I don't like them, I can just stop using them. My other thing about this new set of pronouns is that I would only like for queer and trans people to use them for me. Cishet people, they, them. Queer and or trans people, you can use they, them, or fair. It's all good with me. I'm excited because fair pronouns make me feel very affirmed in my not feeling like a person.
Okay, so again, what we have here is it's such a butchering of language. I almost don't even know where to start. So now you're saying that your pronouns not only depend on how you feel, which by the way, fey and fair, those aren't actual pronouns. Those are made up words that you have grasped onto in an attempt to get attention, just like your stupid pink hair, which by the way, why do they all look like this? Seriously, why do they all look like this? I'll tell you why they all look like this, because it's the same as the pronoun bullcrap. This is nothing more than a bid for attention. This is nothing more than you desperately crying out for someone to focus on you and tell you that you're special. That is all this is. So now you have a list of pronouns based on how you feel, and you also have pronouns that can only be used by other people based on their gender identity. And this would be laughable. This would be ha-ha. This would be absolutely ridiculous. Again, in like a ridiculously sad sort of way, because there are people that actually live like this. If it weren't for the fact that apparently, according to our culture and according to our society, and even according to laws in some places, you have to conform to this. You and I have to understand this and remember this and utilize this, because this is how this person has decided to present themselves in the world. So that's your daily dose of bizarre. I had to get that out of the way and share it with you because, again, just so incredibly mind-blowing that we're even in this space. Speaking of really dumb crap, did you guys happen to catch Jimmy Kimmel on Wednesday night? My assumption is no. Jimmy Kimmel is probably about the most unfunny late-night comedy host. Jimmy Kimmel is... I'm much more of a Jimmy Fallon fan if I had to pick between my Jimmys. Jimmy Kimmel fluctuates between being remarkably unfunny and snide and being incredibly self-righteous. And it makes him absolutely nauseating to listen to. But of course, that gives him the perfect platform to host President Joe Biden, which is exactly what he did on Wednesday night. And of course, among all of the things that they discussed gun control. And Kimmel very pointedly pretty much asked Biden why he's not taking executive action on guns and simply, ignoring Congress and just signing things into law himself, because that's apparently what Democrats have decided that their presidents can do. And Biden answered that he didn't want to emulate Trump by usurping his constitutional authority and overreaching. Again, apparently we're just going to completely ignore the fact that President Obama signed over 300 executive actions and overreached his constitutional authority on everything from international treaties to healthcare to immigration. I mean, he was just signing things willy-nilly all over the place and completely disregarding Congress, and Congress was content to sit back and let him do it. But we're going to ignore all of that and pretend like Donald Trump set the gold standard for executive actions and unconstitutional authority. So Biden says that he doesn't want to emulate that, so he's not going to take executive action on gun control. And here's how that conversation played out. Take a look.
You'd often get asked, look, the Republicans don't play it square. Why do you play it square?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If we do the same thing they do, our democracy will literally be in jeopardy.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
Not a joke. And
I understand that argument, but also it's like you're playing Monopoly with somebody who, won't pass go and won't follow any of the rules. And how do you ever make any progress if they're not following the rules?
We've got to send them to jail, There's that little box in there.
Directly to jail?
Go directly to jail.
So we're just going to jail them. I mean, that's literally Biden's response. Now, you notice that Kimmel, nor Biden, but mostly Kimmel, because he was the one phrasing this question, Kimmel never actually specified what supposed rules the GOP was ignoring here. They never actually got into what that allegation entailed. What rules are Republicans ignoring? The rule that says that they have to vote with Democrats on gun legislation, the rules that say that they have to lockstep with the left's agenda and take away people's Second Amendment rights. What rules exactly is the GOP ignoring here? First of all, at all, but that also would necessitate throwing them in jail for it. That implies that they are somehow breaking the law. But Kimmel never specifies what law they're breaking, what rules they're breaking. And Joe Biden just throws out there, well, what we have to do about it is we just got to throw him in jail. Throw him in jail for what? Exactly. For not kowtowing to what you want. Imagine for just a second, if you will, if President Trump had said this exact thing. Imagine if Trump had gone on, I don't know, Hannity or Tucker or whatever, one of those shows that liberals absolutely detest, and had said, well, they're not playing by the rules, Democrats, they're not doing what we want, so we just got to start throwing them in jail. Imagine if Trump had said that. That would have been the headline for days. Donald Trump is waging a war against the left and threatening to jail anybody who doesn't agree with him. Fascism 101. That's exactly what would have happened. And that's exactly what would have happened. Now, of course, we have to give Biden a pass, A, because he's a left-wing Democrat, so he's allowed to say whatever he wants and threaten whatever he wants. That's perfectly okay. And B, he's also a senile septuagenarian, and we can't really take him seriously because we're never 100% sure if he even knows what he's saying or, I don't know, what room he's in. That's kind of the problem here, right? Is that I think Joe Biden has reached a point where he's being given a pass to say really ridiculous, dumb, off-the-wall stuff. And it's almost looked at as a joke because he doesn't actually understand what it is that he's saying. Now, I get it, okay? A lot of older people and frankly, younger people that have certain ailments, but particularly older people, the older that they get, the more memory starts to become slippery, the more they start to say things. Look, I had a 103-year-old great-grandmother who died with dementia. And God rest her soul, sharp as a tack up until the last few years of her life. But in those days, she swore to us, and she was deathly serious, believed this with all her heart. She swore to us that the nurses at her care facility were drowning babies in the fountain out front the building. I'm not even kidding you. And she earnestly believed it because something wasn't computing in her brain. So I don't know with Joe Biden, when he says this kind of bull crap, whether or not it's an actual coherent thought, but he's the president of the United States. And so in my book, that gives him absolutely no benefit of the doubt. And you have to take what he says as his honest opinion. And apparently that includes just throwing Republicans in jail if they don't lockstep with his agenda and if they don't play by the Democrats' rules. This is the place that leftist gun control advocates are coming from. Whether you believe that Joe Biden was even aware of who he was or what room he was in when he said this, whether you want to, play it off as a joke or say, oh, well, he didn't really understand the question, or he just kind of says off the wall stuff or whatever. This is what left-wing gun control advocates actually want. They are trying to paint this picture. They're trying to create this framework in which if you do not go along with the gun control legislation that they're proposing, if you do not agree with all of the new laws that they want to lay down and all of the restrictions they want to put on the Second Amendment and all the things that they want to ban, then you are culpable and you are complicit in the mass murder of children as if you were directly responsible for it. And Republicans that don't go along with all of the left's supposed solutions to the problem should be jailed. That's essentially what they're saying here. If you don't support things like New York's new law that was just signed on Thursday by the governor that restricts 18, 19, and 20-year-old legal adult Americans from purchasing semi-automatic rifles, not just AR-style rifles, by the way, but any semi-automatic rifle, if you don't agree with that, you are complicit in the mass murder of children. And Republicans should go along with that, or they're not playing by the rules and we need to throw them in jail. Now, here's why I don't like the idea of raising the minimum age to purchase certain firearms to 21 years old, and it's extremely simple. We have decided in this country that at 18 years old, you are a legal adult. You pay taxes like a legal adult. You are held accountable for crimes as a legal adult. And by the way, you can enlist in the military and be drafted into service for this country. And I'm sorry, but I have a serious problem with saying that an 18, 19, 20-year-old young man can be forced to defend other people's rights and freedoms in the same country that he can't even enjoy those rights and freedoms himself. I have a massive problem with that. I understand that 18, 19, and 20 years old is young. I also understand that there are 18, 19, 20-year-old law-abiding gun owners in this country who haven't killed anybody. As a 19-year-old woman who lived on a ground floor apartment in college, I can tell you that there is something seriously wrong with saying that adult Americans cannot exercise their Second Amendment rights simply because they have not reached an arbitrary age. If you look at mass shooters, by the way, although many of them are young, and you can actually go back and listen to my podcast that I did last week breaking down mass shooters by demographic and some of the things that contribute to that and how our environment in this country and in this culture is creating that, has absolutely nothing to do with the firearm or the type of firearm, by the way. But if you look back at mass shooters, for example, Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, was 20 years old and could legally have purchased a semi-automatic firearm at the time. But the gun that he used wasn't even his own gun. It was legally purchased by his mother. The Washington Post compiled a database of 200 school shootings that fit a certain criteria. Of course, this was school shootings, not just mass shootings like a gunman goes into a classroom and starts lighting it up. This was school shootings where anybody fired on school property and somebody was hurt. 200 school shootings. More than 2/3 were committed by shooters under the age of 18. An analysis found that the median age for school shooters was 16 years old. 16 years old. And 2/3 committed by shooters under the age of 18. So that means if you can't even legally purchase a firearm anywhere in the United States until 18 years old, how did that law prevent the violence that was committed by 2/3 of school shooters that were under the age of 18? They could not legally possess a firearm. They could not legally go buy a firearm, but they found a way to get their hands on one anyway. So how would this law have prevented any of that? But of course, leftists can't answer that. So instead, they simply play offensive. And this is where the right absolutely loses the narrative, because what the left does is, instead of having to answer how these laws or how any of their solutions would actually fix the problem, what they do is they turn the tables around and they paint this picture of, if you don't agree with this, if you don't automatically go along with this, if you ask any questions about this, if you challenge this, you must be perfectly fine with dead children and you're not playing by the rules. Case in point. And this is just where it gets so wildly bizarre. I'm just going to dive right in here, because this is probably one of the worst defenses of gun control I have ever read. It cropped up this week. I saw it on Twitter. I don't know how much time you spend on Twitter. This is the kind of garbage that you come across on that godforsaken website. But it's important that we talk about it, because this was not only someone's opinion that came out of their cranium and made its way onto a computer somewhere, that somebody actually thought was decent enough and a good enough argument to write. It actually made it through at least one opinion editor over at the Chicago Sun-Times and was published on that publication and was then promoted on social media. That's how far this got. Here's the headline. Why restrict child porn but not guns? That's the actual honest-to-God headline of this piece of garbage. It was written by a guy named Neil Steinberg, who argues, and this is the subheadline, as if it could get any worse, we eagerly limit our constitutional rights to shield children from one peril, only to shrug off a far worse danger. Now, I actually read this article because I didn't want to argue just against the headline. I wanted to see if this fool could actually defend such a ridiculous notion that child pornography is the same as gun ownership or shares any commonalities with it whatsoever. Here's essentially his argument. Steinberg's argument is that pornography is protected by the First Amendment, but that we limit child pornography that exploits children to protect children, and that that's the same thing as restricting gun ownership in order to protect children. Now, it, of course, assumes an absolute false premise for several different reasons. First of all, and I know I'm going to step on a lot of toes, even among people on the right here, I don't really care, because what I'm about to say is true as gospel. Pornography is vile and disgusting and has no redeeming value whatsoever. So let's go ahead and differentiate pornography from guns right there. Pornography, as much as it has been ruled by a court as protected under First Amendment free speech rights, pornography never positively contributes a thing. There is no redeeming value in pornography. There is no positive use for pornography. If you want to argue with me, if you want to light up my DMs, if you want to get all up in my Facebook messages and try to argue about how pornography isn't really that bad and I don't know what I'm talking about and blah, 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 you go right ahead. You're wrong. Pornography has absolutely no redeeming value whatsoever. There is no situation in which pornography is used for something constructive and good. It is always a negative. But even worse than just pornography in general, child pornography, by its very definition, must sexually exploit or abuse a child in order to exist. That's what child pornography is. It's the sexual exploitation of a child. So it's not just that we are restricting pornography, which is typically a good thing, and we're just saying that child pornography as a subcategory of that is bad. Child pornography, by its very definition, is abuse. As opposed to gun rights and gun ownership and firearms in general, which are almost exclusively used for positive purposes and must be abused in order to do harm. Guns are used millions of times every single day in this country for hunting, for sports shooting, and for home defense or defense of an innocent person that would otherwise be victimized by somebody else. That doesn't mean that they are not lethal on purpose. They are lethal on purpose. In order to do their job, in order to perform their function, they need to work. In order to hunt, You need to be able to humanely put down an animal. You don't want to go running around the woods with a non-lethal weapon that simply wounds an animal and doesn't do its job. That would be absolutely horrible. Nor do you want a home defense weapon that isn't capable of doing its job and defending you and your family against an imminent threat. They need to be lethal on purpose, but not to victimize innocent people. In order for a gun to be used for bad purposes, it needs to be abused, as opposed to child porn, which is always exclusively and by definition abusive. But Steinberg wants to argue that those are the same thing. Why? Because this is what the left does. In the same way that they have to twist things around to make gun owners look culpable in the mass slaughter of children, Steinberg has to paint this picture that child pornography and gun ownership of certain rifles is the same thing, because it puts the onus, or at least attempts to, on the gun owner to try to defend themselves. In other words, the point is this: if you don't bow to our agenda, if you don't agree with our solutions, you are culpable in the mass slaughter of children, and you are no better than a child predator or a child pornographer. That's essentially the argument that's being made here. But it's interesting because this is the only category in which that argument is made. If you look, and again, I know that this point has been made ad nauseum, but we're going to keep making it because it is true. It is true as the day is long. There is no other category of detriment to children that we do this in. If you look, in 2019, 608 child passengers ages 12 and younger died in motor vehicle crashes, and more than 91,000 were injured. 91,000 kids in 2019 alone injured in motor vehicle accidents. Of the children 12 and younger who died in a crash for whom restraint use was known, 38% were not buckled up. We already have laws in this country that state that you and any passenger in your car, especially underage children, have to be wearing a seatbelt or in a proper car seat when you're in a vehicle. We already have those laws, and yet those laws seem to be ignored all over the place, and we have children that are dying in motor vehicle accidents because those laws are being ignored, because people still get in vehicles and drink and drive, because people still run stoplights even though they're not supposed to, because people still run stop signs even though they're not supposed to, because people go flying down the highway at a bajillion miles an hour even though they're not supposed to. We have laws that are supposed to prevent this, and yet they do not prevent every single death. Why? Because people continue to abuse motor vehicles. People continue to be negligent, even though there are laws saying that they shouldn't, even though there are laws putting down penalties for doing so. And we understand that that is a risk of being a motorized society. We do not restrict vehicles and say people cannot drive cars because accidents happen. Why? Well, because we understand with our common sense and the brains that God gave us that vehicles serve positive purposes and only create accidents when there is negligence or abuse. We understand that it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to keep Bob from driving to work in his four-door sedan simply because Joe over here yesterday blasted through a stoplight because he was drunk as a skunk and T-boned a minivan and killed 4 people. We understand that vehicles are used in everyday life for positive purposes. So we don't take an extremely tragic minority of accidents and deaths and use that to restrict vehicles for the masses. Same with unintentional injuries. More than 7,000 children and teens ages 0 to 19 died because of unintentional injuries in 2019. That's about 20 deaths a day. Leading causes of child unintentional injury include motor vehicle crashes, suffocation, drowning, poisoning, fires, and falls. The CDC says that child injury is often preventable. But just like we don't outlaw vehicles, we don't outlaw pools, we don't outlaw chemicals in the home, we don't outlaw fireplaces, We don't outlaw stairs because children fall down them. Again, because we understand innately that that's absolutely ridiculous. And that we cannot restrict ourselves to that extent. The Washington Post says that every 46 minutes, a child goes to an ER after furniture falls on them. But we're not out there outlawing dressers. Nearly 1,000 minors died of overdoses in 2020. 1,000 minors. That was up exponentially over the year before. By the way, why? Well, because we were in the middle of a pandemic and we decided that it was a good idea to rip children out of their classrooms and put them in houses where oftentimes they didn't have parental supervision. And we can't talk about the opioid crisis, and we can't talk about our lax border security that causes God only knows how many drugs to come across every single day. We can't talk about that. So we're just going to gloss over all of the children that are dying of overdoses. But when it comes to guns, all of a sudden, that's a massive crisis. Here's some of the data that gun control advocates are going to point to in order to make their point. So gun deaths. In 2020, there were a total number of, 45,222 total gun deaths in 2020. Now, again, that was up exponentially from the year before because, again, middle of a pandemic, creating a mental health crisis, throwing a whole bunch of kids at home with no parental supervision. Now, 45,222, that includes children, teenagers, adults, everybody. Of those, 45% were suicides and 43% were murders. Now, of those murders, 59% were with handguns and only 3% were with rifles, a subcategory of which is the AR-15. So 3% were rifles in general. Even fewer than that were committed with AR-15s. So, by the way, when we're talking about gun violence, it is extremely important that we separate suicides and accidents from homicides. Because again, what you're going to see with gun control advocates time and time and time again is these big picture numbers that paint a picture of a society in which everybody is just running around shooting everybody to death. 45,222 total gun deaths in 2020 sounds absolutely horrific and is absolutely horrific. But if you use that to paint the picture of some wild, wild west scenario in which a bunch of kids are running around willy-nilly just shooting one another, that would be a false starting point. That's a false picture. Over half of those are suicides, people deciding to take their own lives. Now, let me be very clear. That is no less tragic. It is no less tragic when a child does it, a teenager does it, an adult does it. Suicide is absolutely horrific, and there are steps that we can and should be taking in this country to help address that endemic. We absolutely should. But that is a completely separate issue than things like mass shootings in which innocent people are being targeted by a deranged gunmen. So we have to be able to separate these categories if we're going to start handing out legislation meant to address mass shootings and perpetrators of gun violence. Let's talk about kids specifically from 2019 to 2020. Firearm-related deaths among children rose 29.5%. Now, you're going to see this seized upon, again, by gun control advocates to paint a picture of gun control and of gun violence running amok among children and teenagers. Experts actually point to, again, the pandemic as a reason, with many children being left at home alone with little parental supervision, the mental health crises among teenagers having been taken out of school. All of these were massive contributing factors. So again, the same guns that existed before, the handguns that existed before, the AR-15s that existed before, the shotguns that existed before, that didn't change. What changed is that we sent a whole bunch of kids into isolation in their homes and made them fearful of the air, destroyed their academic careers, took them away from their peers and any socialization that they had, put them in homes with stressed out parents, many of whom weren't even there during the day. That's what changed. Because in addition, drug overdoses and poisoning also increased by 83.6% between 2019 and 2020. So again, I give you that the guns is not what changed. This is not a gun problem. This is a societal problem. This is a people problem. We created an environment that fostered this. Has nothing at all to do with the same exact gun that in 2019 was sitting on the table doing absolutely nothing, hopefully not actually in a table, by the way, hopefully in a lockbox somewhere or in a safe. There's laws about that too. But that same exact gun that was doing absolutely no harm the year before, now suddenly doing harm in 2020 because the environment is what changed. A Johns Hopkins study found that firearms were the leading cause of death for children and teens ages 1 through 19. Prematurely taking the lives of 4,357 young people in 2020. 30% were suicides. Another 9% were accidents. And guess who was the most single affected group of gun violence in 2020 among teenagers and children? Black teenagers. Black teenagers accounted for the most affected group. Not elementary school students who were being mowed down by crazy gunmen. We have a society problem. We have an environmental problem. If you look at mass shootings by themselves, Statista reports that in 2018, 80 people in the United States died from mass shootings. And again, when we talk about mass shootings, we're not just talking about school shootings. We're not talking about people in the grocery store aisle when a gunman comes in. We're not talking about people that get shot in a mall or a Las Vegas concert, which again, we're still not allowed to ask about. We're talking about mass shootings in general. So this includes drive-bys. This includes pretty much any incidents in which three or four people, in addition to the gunman, are shot in a single incident. So you're talking about gang violence. A whole lot falls under the umbrella of mass shooting. So again, we have to start breaking this down by category to understand the problem and what may actually fix it. So in 2018, 80 people killed in mass shootings across the United States. In 2019, 71. In 2020, when everything was locked down and nobody was out and about, only 9 people were killed in mass shootings. And in 2021, 42. That's a lot smaller of a number than the 45,000 that we just read a minute ago. Again, so you see how when you start to break down gun violence in this country, that is a broad panorama that deals with lots of different cases. And there's no single piece of legislation that you're going to throw down that's going to fix this. But somebody like Steinberg wants to throw out these big numbers and tell you that gun violence and children dying in mass shootings is a more prevalent danger in their lives than child exploitation and child pornography. So let me read you some of those numbers so that we get a pretty good picture here. If you actually do some Googling and you try to figure out how many American children are exploited for child pornography every single year, that's almost impossible to find. And I'm not really sure how you would even begin to track such a thing. But we can find these numbers. More than 29 million reports of suspected child sexual exploitation are received by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children annually. That's over 563,461 reports per week. We don't know how many children are exploited every single year for child pornography, but I can tell you that Homeland Security investigations made 3,771 criminal arrests relating to child exploitation in the 2019 fiscal year alone. That marked an 18% increase from the previous fiscal year. In 2021, tech companies reported over 45 million online photos and videos of children being sexually abused. That's more than double what they found the previous year. And of the more than 23,500 runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2018, 1 in 7 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. That's nearly 3,400 kids. Those are just a few of the numbers on child exploitation. I mean, to compare child pornography and the abuse and the victimization and the trauma that causes, and say that that is a less prevalent danger, both to children and to our society in general, to say that, how did he put it? that gun violence is a far worse danger than child pornography. If your brain is so rotted that you're using child pornography as a benchmark to argue against firearms, if that's a stretch that you can even begin to comprehend, something is terribly wrong in your soul. The idea that that's even your starting point. But even beyond that, the simple numbers do not back up that gun violence, particularly in the realm that people like Steinberg want to use. Because again, we're not talking about gun violence in general. This comes up whenever there's a mass shooting of innocent people, which, as tragic and horrific as it is not a statistically likely event that an American child is going to encounter. Is it happening more than it should? Absolutely. Again, I reference you back to my podcast from last week in which we talk about some of the factors that contribute and some of the data that is directly correlated to mass shootings in this country and why we are seeing so many angry young men go into places and mow down innocent people with firearms. But that is still an extremely statistically unlikely event. And to use broad brush numbers that ignore details and ignore the fact to paint a picture of children not being able to walk out of their own door without being shot to death on their front doorstep, which, by the way, happens in places like Chicago, but we can't talk about that. Happens in places like New York City, but we can't talk about that. Happens in Democrat strongholds all across this country, but we can't talk about that. To paint the picture that this is a situation that is routinely faced by America's children is a lie and is fear-mongering. And it is perpetuated by the same exact people who have absolutely no problem with upwards of 1 million children being poisoned and dismembered and ripped out of their mother's wombs before they can even draw a free breath, by the same people who think that 18 and 19-year-olds who can go off to war legally but shouldn't be allowed to own a firearm, but at the same time, a toddler at the age of 2 years old can tell you whether or not he's a boy or a girl or something in between. That we should be able to pump children full of puberty blockers and hormone therapy and perform body-altering surgeries on them before the age of 18 because they know what's best for their bodies, even though their brains haven't even fully developed. That think that it is perfectly okay to take underage children to drag shows and pride parades where they're forced to see public nudity and all manner of perverse and deviant behavior. All of that is perfectly fine to these same exact people. So you will spare me your indignant remarks about how you simply want to protect children when you're making the argument that child pornography is a restriction that we place upon ourselves voluntarily, because while pornography is a good thing, child pornography might be a bridge too far. We need to protect the children, but that's not as bad as gun violence. Give me a break, you sick, perverted weirdo. But this is the picture that the gun control left wants to paint. If you are a gun owner and you do not agree with their restrictions and you do not agree with all of this legislation, you're not following the rules. Legislators who vote against them should be jailed. You are no better than a child pornographer. And that argument made its way into a national publication in the United States of America. That is where we're at. And that is what we are pushing against. And with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show for this week. Make sure you tune back in next week, you guys. Also, make sure that you go back and watch last week's podcast. really did break down a lot of sort of the societal factors that I think really have contributed to where we're at today. You can watch full episodes on YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, and Facebook. You also need to go onto iTunes and make sure that you hit the subscribe button to the Brittany Hughes Show. That way you're never going to miss an episode. And I'll see you back here next week.